I'm Paul Sheesley, and today we're talking about the role of emotional intelligence in executive leadership. Bringing this up for a few reasons. One, because emotional intelligence is not or is one of the most overused and underdefined areas of leadership. A lot of people talk about it like it means being nice or calm, warm, agreeable, or relationally polished. But that is not what executive emotional intelligence actually is. The second reason, because at the executive level, emotional intelligence is not just a soft skill sitting off to the side. It directly affects judgment, trust, decision making, conflict, culture, and whether strategy actually moves through people cleanly. And the third reason, because many leaders are far more emotionally reactive than they realize. They think they are being strategic when they are actually being driven by ego threat, control needs, anxiety, defensiveness, or some internal noise they have not separated from reality. Why me? I'm a psychotherapist and an executive coach and founder of EPC Leadership, Executive Performance Coaching. I work with CEOs and senior leaders in high pressure environments where leadership is not just about vision or intelligence, it's about whether a leader can stay clear enough to internally work through things, relate well, and lead well under pressure. So in this video, I want to break down what emotional intelligence really means at the executive level, what it is not, and why it matters far beyond relationships, and how it connects to inner architecture, strategic alignment, and adaptive leadership. Emotional intelligence is usually talked about too vaguely, as I mentioned before. When people hear the phrase emotional intelligence, they often think of something vague and overly polished, like being personable or empathetic or self-aware, having good people skills and being calm, or knowing how to read the room. Those things matter, but that definition is too thin for executive leadership. Because at the executive level, emotional intelligence is not just whether people like being around you, it's whether you can accurately perceive, interpret, regulate, and use emotional information without getting hijacked by your own. That is a very different thing. Executive emotional intelligence means you can tell the difference between a strategic signal and your own internal reaction. You can stay connected to reality when your status feels threatened. And you can hear challenge without collapsing into your own defensiveness. You're able to tolerate ambiguity without becoming controlling. And you can lead people through tension without either avoiding it or contributing by escalating it. That is much more serious leadership competency than being emotionally aware. And this is where I think many organizations get it wrong. They reduce emotional intelligence to relational style when in reality it is a judgment issue, a system issue, and a leadership integrity issue. Because the moment a leader cannot distinguish internal noise, emotional noise, from external reality, their leadership starts to become distorted. So emotional intelligence is not niceness. One of the biggest mistakes people make is confusing emotional intelligence with being nice. A leader can be very pleasant and still have very low emotional intelligence. They can be socially polished, relationally smooth, warm in public, and still be deeply avoidant and defensive, or unable to tolerate feedback, or hold these hard conversations directly. Likewise, a leader can be direct, firm, and highly emotional intelligent. Because emotional intelligence is not about tone management, it's about accuracy, it's about regulation and disciplined awareness under threat and pressure. A leader with emotional intelligence does not just make people comfortable. They're able to stay present with discomfort without becoming distracted and distorted by it. So that means they're going to be able to deliver difficult feedback without cruelty. They're able to hear dissent and not become punitive. They're able to sit in that uncertainty without manufacturing some false certainty and remain connected to the strategic task, even when the emotions are running high. That's real emotional intelligence. So if you think it is only as empathy or interpersonal smoothness, you're missing the whole point. Because at the executive level, emotional intelligence is not softness. It is internal steadiness in service of clear leadership. So why does emotional intelligence matter so much at the executive level? At lower levels of organization, lack of emotional intelligence can damage a team. At an executive level, it can distort the entire system. Because leaders do not just manage tasks, they shape the meaning, tone, pace, trust, decision quality, and the emotional climate around their strategy or the organization's strategy. Their reactions travel throughout the system. If an executive cannot regulate their anxiety or urgency, their own internal urgency, it will spread. If an executive cannot tolerate challenge, people become careful and they become political. And if an executive personalizes disagreement, honest dialogue will collapse. If an executive becomes rigid under pressure, the whole system's going to get tighter. It's going to get slower, bottleneck, defensiveness occurs. So this is why emotional intelligence matters so much more than what people think. It's not just about whether you are good with people. It's about whether your internal state becomes a source of clarity or distortion for the organization and other leaders. Like I say, leaders transmit their nervous system. That does not mean everyone should become therapists. It means that a leader's internal processing becomes external culture much faster than most people realize. So when executive emotional intelligence is weak, the organization pays for it in ways that get mislabeled, such as communication issues, alignment issues, engagement issues, culture issues, or resistance to change. And sometimes those things are real, but sometimes what you are actually looking at is a leadership team with poor emotional differentiation and low internal awareness. So emotional intelligence starts with self-awareness, but it just can't stop there. A lot of leadership content says emotional intelligence begins with self-awareness, and that is true, but awareness by itself is not enough. They may know I get impatient, I don't like being challenged, I can be intense, or not great with confrontation. I know I can come on strong, and that's true, that can be accurate, but it's still not enough, because executive emotional intelligence is not just noticing your tendencies. It's being able to intervene on them in real time so they do not run the strategy, the communication, or the relationships around you. That is the difference between awareness and regulation. A leader may be fully aware they get reactive under pressure and still continue to distort things, shut people down, rush decisions, create confusion amongst the team. So when I think about emotional intelligence in executive leadership, I think of it in 4 separate layers. So the first one is self-perception. Can I identify what I am feeling, name it accurately? The second is self-interpretation. Can I understand what is driving that feeling? The third is self-regulation. Can I prevent that feeling from hijacking my judgment or behavior, which ultimately affects the strategy? And fourth is the relational use. Can I engage other people's emotional reality without losing the task, the truth, or the structure? That is much more a complete version of emotional intelligence. So I want to talk a bit about emotional intelligence and inner architecture. This is where emotional intelligence connects directly to your inner architecture model. A leader's inner architecture shapes what they perceive, what they fear, what they defend, and how they interpret pressure around them. So if a leader has deep issues around control, they may interpret delegation as kind of dangerous. And if they have status sensitivity, they may experience disagreement as disrespect. Or if they have a fear of inadequacy, they may over-prepare, over-manage, over-talk, or avoid exposure. And if they're driven by perfectionistic schemas, they can call it excellence when it's really anxiety. So this is why emotional intelligence is not just a communication skill, it's an inner architecture skill. Because unless a leader understands their own inner operating system, they will keep missing internal activation for external truth. They're going to think things like, this is urgent when it's really my anxiety, or this is unacceptable when it's really my ego being hurt, or this person's not aligned when it's really a threat response to some dissent, or, we need more control when it's really fear-based. And that confusion can get expensive. So emotional intelligence in executive leadership is not merely being able to name the emotions, it's being able to recognize how your inner architecture affects what you think is happening. That is a very advanced leadership discipline that I help teach leaders with. Emotional intelligence will improve strategic alignment. Emotional intelligence is also essential for a strategic alignment. And that's because strategy has to move through conversations, trade-offs, uncertainty, conflict, disappointment, resistance, competing priorities, and human interaction. And that means if a leader cannot regulate themselves, alignment starts breaking down long before anyone uses the word alignment. A reactive executive can make priorities feel unstable, and a defensive executive can make honest feedback feel dangerous. Just the same as an anxious executive can overload a leadership team organization with metrics and check-ins and premature pivots. Someone who's conflict avoidant can preserve harmony at the expense of real clarity. So emotional intelligence is weak, the strategy gets contaminated by unprocessed emotions. Now, the team is not just executing the business, it is adapting the leader's reactions. This is one of the clearest signs of poor executive and emotional intelligence, is that the organization starts reading the leader instead of reading the strategy. They start asking, what mood are they in? How do I say this without triggering them? Are we changing direction again? Do they actually want honesty here? Should we tell the truth and we have to manage the reaction? Once that starts happening, the strategy or the strategic alignment is affected and impacted. And so it's about helping strategy move through the organization without feeling distorted by the leader carrying it. So when we think about adaptive leadership and emotional intelligence also matters because leadership is adaptive. Executives are constantly asked to operate in ambiguity, change, loss, conflict, incomplete data, shifting markets, political complexity, and human resistance. That means the job is not just to know things, the job is to tolerate this disequilibrium without collapsing into reactivity. And so this is where the emotional intelligence becomes essential. Can you stay thoughtful when the answer is not obvious? Are you able to hold tension without rushing into relive it in a way that weakens the work? And are you able to sit with resistance long enough to understand whether it's fear or wisdom or self-protection or a valid concern? Are you able to observe anxiety from the system without transmitting it back out faster and louder? That's adaptive leadership. And without emotional intelligence, leaders tend to do one of two things. They either over control or they're over accommodate or overcompensate. And neither one is strong leadership. The executive with low emotional intelligence cannot hold the productive middle. They want certainty too quickly. They want agreement too quickly. They want discomfort resolved before the real work is done. But adaptive leadership often requires staying in tension without becoming consumed. That is why emotional intelligent leaders are usually better at change, not because they enjoy tension, but because they can metabolize it without becoming ruled by it. So what is other examples of poor emotional intelligence? So I think it's important to keep it practical. Poor emotional intelligence and executive leadership doesn't always look dramatic. It actually looks polished. It's defensiveness disguised as conviction, or control disguised as standards, avoidance disguised as diplomacy or false claim that covers disconnection, or even over-explaining to manage insecurity, or performative empathy with real no follow-through, or intense decisiveness that is really intolerance of ambiguity. It can also look like shutting people down when challenged, or misreading tension as disloyalty, or becoming cold when threatened. Using strategy language to mask emotional reactions, or rewriting history after a reactive moment, or needing to be the emotional center of the room. Again, the issue is not that a leader has feelings. The issue is whether they can have feelings without making everyone else in the organization around them. That is a very clean test, I think. If the team spends too much time adapting to the leader's emotional field, that leader's emotional intelligence is not as strong as many people think. So, on the other hand, strong emotional intelligence looks something very specific. It looks like a leader who can stay connected to reality under pressure. They do not need to deny emotions. They do not need to perform calmness. They don't need to become robotic. They simply have enough internal differentiation that they can say, I feel the pressure and I'm not going to confuse it with pressure with clarity, or I feel threatened, I'm not going to make a mistake for someone else being wrong. Or they can accept the urgency, but not turn that into a strategic, chaotic thing. And they're able to tolerate disappointment and not let that become some sort of contempt. And they can feel the uncertainty without having to over-control things just to soothe their own uncertainty. And that's what real emotional intelligence looks like. Again, it's not the absence of emotion. It's the ability to have an emotion without surrendering judgment to it. And relationally, it means people can tell them the truth. Conflict doesn't immediately become personal, and feedback survives, and trust becomes more possible. And the organization doesn't have to spend so much energy managing the leader. That's a huge executive advantage. So the real question is whether emotions are being used well or leaked everywhere. And I think the real executive question is not, do I have emotional intelligence? Because most leaders are going to say yes. You will say yes. The real question is, how do my emotions enter the system? Do they come in as clarity, signal, empathy, discipline, grounded reality, Or do they come in as pressure and confusion and volatility and defensiveness, inconsistencies? Because emotions are going to enter leadership no matter what. The only question is whether they are processed enough to become useful. And an emotionally intelligent executive can use emotion as data. They can say the room's anxious. This team does not feel safe telling me the truth. Or there is grief under this resistance, or the status fear underneath this argument. There's tension here because we're asking for adoption but rewarding compliance. That's emotional intelligence in leadership. It uses emotional information to improve judgment rather than replace it. So here's a few takeaways. The role of emotional intelligence in executive leadership is not about being nice or polished or agreeable or emotionally expressive. It's about whether a leader can accurately understand their own internal reactions. They're able to regulate them under pressure and engage other people's emotional reality without losing strategic clarity. Because at the executive level, emotions do not stay personal. They enter decisions and relationships. They enter trust and culture and the way strategy gets carried throughout the system. A leader with strong emotional intelligence helps create that coherence. A leader with weak emotional intelligence creates distortion, even if they're smart and driven or highly competent. So the real leadership question is not whether emotion belongs in the executive life, because it already does. The question is whether it's being managed well enough to serve the work rather than quietly sabotaging it. And that is the kind of leadership work I care most about, where inner architecture, strategic alignment, and adaptive leadership all come together in real time. Thanks for listening.